So it is now 2:20, and that has been stirring for 15 minutes. You see it hasn't really changed much. Kind of foamy because I'm stirring it so vigorously. And it's a nice yellow suspension. So I'm going to return that to the water bath, or to the ice bath, I mean. Cool that down again prior to adding our sodium hydroxide and sodium thiosulfate. And while that was stirring, I did the dishes. And I also weighed out a gram of sodium hydroxide, about 1.025 grams of sodium hydroxide, in fact. And I put that on a weighing paper so I could distinguish it from the sodium thiosulfate. So these two solids are going to be being added once that cools down again. So we're waiting for that to cool down. I'm going to use this graduated cylinder that's sitting here and the 95% ethanol that I already made to make up the 50% ethanol that we're going to need. So we've got about 12 milliliters of that 95% ethanol. And I'm going to call it 50% if I add 11 milliliters, right, to go up to a total of 23 milliliters with the DI water. That will be close enough. 23 milliliters. And we'll just pour that back in here. Cover it with the watch glass so it stays temperature we want. And I can just rinse that again. Just had a little ethanol in it. So that's the 50% ethanol made up that we need for the recrystallization. I shouldn't need any more of that, but I'm keeping it around just in case I do. So we take this beaker off again. And I'm going to add the sodium thiosulfate first. Stick that in there. See that it's turning the solution from yellow to white, quenching any excess bromine that happened to be in there. And then I'm going to add the sodium hydroxide. You see there's a little droplet there. Sodium hydroxide sucks up moisture from the air and turns into a goo if you leave it sit around for too long. Take these and put them in the trash. Again, nice white suspension this time. And we just need to let that sit so all those solids dissolve. It's going to be a little bit difficult to tell because there's precipitate as well. But since I ground up the sodium thiosulfate pretty well, it should dissolve fairly readily. And I'm going to use my glass stirring rod just to around the edges just to make sure there's no solid kind of adhering to the sides of that drilling our flask. Usually takes a little while for the sodium thiosulfate to dissolve, so I'm going to let it probably go for about another 5 minutes till 2:30, and then we can work that up. I'll turn my vacuum back on in preparation. Make sure that's still a sealed plate. At this point I think I can remove my ice bath, let it warm up to room temperature, or at least closer to room temperature. We don't want it to warm too much. I'm going to get some fresh ice because we will need to ice down our 50% ethanol eventually to use as a cold washing after the recrystallization. So we'll just have that ice bath sitting back there, getting ready. So if I hold this up, what I'm looking for is fairly uniform. I don't want a bunch of solid. I can still see some solid kind of collecting there. That's probably the sodium thiosulfate and sodium hydroxide. So we'll let that go. The magnetic stir bar retriever at the ready to take that stir bar out. I'm going to go ahead and put the ethanol back. Pretty sure I'm done with it. Grab a label here. Because this compound is going to be DCl-10-65A. I'm going to be using the usual transfer to a 10 milliliter beaker to dry in the desiccator overnight. We'll grab a nice clean 10 milliliter beaker. And stick our label on and tape it in place. So that'll be ready. Go get a mass. Quite teared. That looks like 9.257 grams. 9.257 grams for the beaker. That aside. Good vacuum. I think all of my solids have dissolved. What I have is a suspension of product at this point. We can go ahead and filter that after we take the stir bar out and stir off. I'll use that stir bar to stir the 50% ethanol as I'm heating it. I'm going to start heating that 50% ethanol. Bring this up to about 100. I'll need that for the recrystallization. Meanwhile, I'm going to filter this. Looks like a fairly fine suspension, so it may filter somewhat slowly. You can see it's a little bit foamy. That's the result of the reaction, generating some gases. Don't actually need that, I don't think. Put that one back, get out of the way. Right, definitely filtering a little more slowly than sometimes because of the fineness of the solid. And once that's filtered, we're going to want to rinse that with a little bit of ice water. I'm just going to run some ice water down the walls of this Erlenmeyer just to try to get as much of that solid off as I can. Pour that through. This was the beaker that was sitting on top. It really won't have gotten dirty. Now we're just going to rinse that with a pipette or two full of ice water to get any residual sodium hydroxide out. We're going to let that sit, a little bit of air run through to try to dry it a bit. Doesn't have to be completely dry before we crystallize it, but we'd like to get a crude yield that's at least approximate. And then we're going to recrystallize that in a Erlenmeyer flask. Since I'm not sure how much ethanol we're going to need, I think I'm going to use a 50 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. So I'm going to mass that, and then I will transfer the solid to that and get our crude yield. So we look like 39.717 grams on the Erlenmeyer. 39.717. I think the best thing for transferring that solid into that flask would be one of the medium-sized flat spatulas. We don't actually need that stirring rod anymore. We don't need this anymore either. Just had ethanol in it. Soap in that and let that soak. So that's not 100% dry, but I think it's dry enough to use. Let's break our vacuum. Set that aside, we're going to use that again. Now I'd like to try transfer as much of this solid as possible into the tared Erlenmeyer flask. See, it's a little wet. If we really wanted it to be dry, we'd need to dry that in the desiccator overnight. But we're only going to do that at the stage when it's recrystallized.